Okay, pop quiz. Last week we discussed some of the contours of law as it's understood in ancient Israel. Oh, everyone's having such a good morning. This is good.
You need a whistle.
No, that's okay. We'll let everyone get settled in. That's all right.
Praise the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
We are blessed to have Dr. Joel soon.
Someday, maybe.
Subject to be soon. Dr. Joel Wildermuth here for his last week. I'm sure you've been blessed by his first 2 weeks. Quick reminder too, before I head out, next week we're going to be joined by Dr. Timothy Beal, author visit. He'll be here with us over Zoom. If you want to pick up one of his books, we have copies of it. And his book, When Time is Short, is about the not looming, but present ecological crisis. So that's next week over Zoom. Joel, take it.
Excellent. Yeah. So last week we discussed ancient Israelite law and how there's an intention behind the laws that we read in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, right? Depending on which version of the law you're looking at. And the intention is to preserve the holiness of the temple, or if you're in the wilderness narratives, of the tabernacle, right? The traveling tent, that was where God's presence resided with the Israelites. But in Jerusalem, it's to preserve the holiness of the temple, and as you move outward from the temple, the holiness of the people, and the holiness of the entire land. And so we looked at we looked at how everything is organized according to two binaries, whether something is holy and pure, or whether something is profane, holy or profane, or pure and impure. And we note that everyone is subject to ritual impurity. So it is assumed that if you have a wound, if you have a genital discharge, or a discharge of semen, or you have a skin condition that's commonly translated as leprosy, these are unavoidable ritual impurity. And that's okay, because there are ways to fix that. There are ways to restore one's body to ritual use so that you can participate in the community, not just in a religious sense, but in a social and communal sense also. Moral impurity is another matter. Moral impurity is avoidable. You can choose whether you're going to kill someone or not kill someone. And there are certain sexual laws which we'll get into. There's some choice around how that happens. These must be atoned for, and there must be some kind of punishment imposed for them, so that there is a chance that you can be grafted back into the community, but that's not always the case. And I want to emphasize that things here associated with ritual impurity are not regarded as sinful. This is just a part of life that has to be dealt with, and the law is there to allow you to deal with them and to maintain an active and full participant in the life of the community. So, today we are going to spend some time on some trouble. What did I call this series? Troublesome text or difficult text, right? Okay. Difficult text. Welcome to the Bible. I'm going to speak on this subject from the biblical perspective, from a text perspective. I want to invite all of you, as a congregation, if you have worked through issues around human sexuality and gender identity, can I just have you seem to be a very welcoming congregation. I feel like feels very similar to my congregation, Gethsemane, which in the Lutheran world we have Reconciling in Christ. In Presbyterian, is there like an organization or? Okay. So, we're talking about adult things, we're talking about real things today. You may raise your hand or Joel just start speaking, okay? I welcome dialogue on this. As I said, I'm speaking about this from the perspective of the text, and there may be other theological and ethical concerns that, of course, Pastor Joel, you may speak to, or anyone else who has thoughts or reactions to this. So I just want to give that preface up front, okay? So, Leviticus, are we all familiar with the clobber text in the Bible? The texts that are clobber texts is the term used for the usually isolated verses in particularly in the New Testament, but also here in the Old Testament, that are used to justify an ideology that says gay people are sinful, homosexuality is sinful. Okay, are we familiar with this line of thinking? So these are kind of the two paramount, when you think about the Old Testament clobber texts, this is what we go to. And I use the word text intentionally. There's another, Sodom and Gomorrah. That gets pulled out. And Sodom and Gomorrah is an idea. Okay, that's not a text they're talking about. When I say they, folks who will use these texts to justify exclusion of LGBTQ people, either from participation in the church or participation in the hereafter sometime, however you conceive of that. You should check out, what is it? Is it Ezekiel? Everyone thinks that Sodom and Gomorrah is about, they focus on the sexual impropriety part. When you go to Ezekiel and you look at what Ezekiel says, what was Sodom's sin?
Think about this immigrant.
Greed.
Yes, greed and inhospitality. That is how the tradition remembers Sodom and Gomorrah. So that aspect of the sin of sexuality or sexual impropriety is not, that's not the focus. So here we are in Leviticus. Let's start out at the level of the text. Translation is always difficult. And I had a professor who provocatively said one time that anyone who translates scripture to you is just lying to you. All translation is fibbing, okay? Because we actually can't get an exact translation of how people's brains in this time would have understood the words we have here, okay? Biblical Hebrew, I can't remember if I mentioned this here or if it was in my other lectures. Biblical Hebrew is a much more embodied kind of language. When we think of heart, when we think of the concept of writing these words on your heart, or when we think of the mind, when we think of the term soul, it's easy for us to theologize those things and to make those a kind of a theological concept. Whereas in biblical Hebrew, the heart, Hebrew word is levav, the heart is like this part of your body. I mean, it's like, and it's connected to the mind, but the mind is not, there's not a word for mind in Hebrew. So when we have heart, it's this connection, it's an embodied thing. When you think about this, the ruach, the wind or the spirit or the breath that God breathes into human beings in the beginning, like the wind of God is not just some theological concept. Like it's a real thing. The breath of God is breathed into human beings, and that's what animates them. So it's a much more embodied thing. So in translating, there's just a lot of space in culture and in time and history between us and the text. And so we have to be aware that the English translations we have today are people who have done a good job fibbing to us. No, some people do it better than others. So I wanted to present a very wooden, literal translation of these verses so that you can just get an idea of how difficult the Hebrew actually is here. So a literal translation of Leviticus 18:22 reads, "And with a male, you shall not lie the beds of a woman. It is an abomination." Okay? Does that make sense? You shall not lie the beds of a woman. 20, verse 13. "And a man who lies with a male, the beds of a woman, the two of them have committed an abomination." Which two? "They will certainly be put to death. Their blood is upon them." So just looking in here, how many parties are active here? You have a male that's listed. You have, really, the beds of a woman.
Yeah, it's more than one bed. not
But it's also directed at you. So presumably, someone is reading. You have a reader, you have a male, you have a woman. Okay? Here, a man who lies with a male, the beds of a woman. There's 3 parties listed there.
So in translation, the lies in would be how we would, right?
Lies in.
In the beds.
Well, we'll see. I have some examples of what translators do with this.
I heard that.
As we can see, a literal translation doesn't really help us to understand these verses. So, I've got some examples up here of some of the main NRSV and ESV. "You shall not lie with a male as with a woman." That phrase, "as with a woman," is a phrase that does not exist in the Hebrew. So, nearly all of the main translations try to render this "beds of a woman" idiomatically. And it might be true that in this day that they're talking about, that was an idiomatic phrase for something. But modern translators are rendering it in a modern idiom rather than trying to understand what the ancient idiom might have meant. ESV does the same thing there. NIV, "do not have sexual relations," and the words in italics I put to say that this word doesn't exist. These words don't exist in the original, in the Hebrew. NASB, "You shall not sleep with a male as one sleeps with a female." The verb "sleep" does not appear in the Hebrew. CEB, which I like the CEB because it renders not this. I like the CEB in general because it's done by a lot of modern scholars. They're good, and they're trying to render the Bible into a more common English while being faithful to the text. You'll see there are other paraphrases out there that try to do modern idiomatic English, like the New Living Translation. "Do not practice homosexuality," having sex with another man. You may as well have just not even looked at the biblical text and just wrote what you wanted to write there.
Right.
Even the Young's literal translation, which styles itself as providing a wooden, this is the real thing. "And with a male, thou dost not lie, as one lieth with a woman." Again, even that "as one lieth with a woman." There's no, in Hebrew, I would be looking for a preposition, a certain kind of preposition for "as one lieth," and I would need another preposition with a woman, and we just don't get that. So you can see that modern translators are doing some pretty generous work on rendering this into some form that we can understand. There is no scholarly consensus on what is meant in these verses. So I just discussed what translators are doing. In the scholarly literature, there's no consensus. There are about 21 scholarly approaches to this verse. 21 different ways of trying to understand what is happening here. I don't just mean translating, but I mean, what's the rationale behind this prohibition?
If you take it just as it is, though, it would make me think, well, maybe women don't have a bed. Maybe they're not given a place.
that women don't have a place.
Don't have that,
So is this verse referring to a place, or is it referring to an act? Or is it, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Also, we'll just keep going. 21 interpretations ranging from, you've got the classic, a blanket prohibition on homosexuality. Okay, that's one, or same-sex relationships. All the way up to, this is a prohibition of 2 males and a female having a threesome. That is the latest, I laugh, but that is the latest. That's the latest scholarly argument, some of these creative things. And the argument goes is that you have 3 parties listed in here. So that, and I just say that to say and everything in between there.
Joe,
Yes.
I just looked up the Message translation. Yeah, I mean, it's always kind of interesting to look at
Oh,
that.
it is interesting.
And this says, if a man has sex with his daughter-in-law, both of them must be put to death.
Oh, you might have a different, do you have 1822?
Yeah, 1822, right. Is that, maybe I didn't.
Because that sounds like it comes from the same repertoire of, there are other sexual prohibitions in this law, in this section of law. These are the 2 verses that we're looking at because they get used in, modern day arguments about human sexuality more frequently.
They get clonword juice.
Yes, they get used as clobber texts. Is it possible, I'm gonna check the Bible here. Maybe I wrote down the wrong, am I leading you astray on this reference?
Yeah, I was,
Leviticus 18.
No, that's right.
No, it's right, okay. 1822. So, let's identifying and defining terms is always a good thing to do when we're doing this. So, we need to differentiate between homosexuality as a sexual orientation and homosexual acts. And I say that because homosexual acts, and when I'm using that, I should be more careful that I'm not using that in a pejorative way. When we talk about same-sex acts, those are available to scholars to study throughout history, okay? Same-sex acts are able to be studied, whereas sexual orientations are not able to be studied historically. Those are not accessible to scholars because we can't sit down with people from antiquity and discuss with them how they think about sexuality. And even then to recognize that the ways that we think about sexuality as primarily being about orientation is a late thing in the discourse. I'm not necessarily here to talk about the theory behind all of this, but there are other ways that human beings would discuss their sexuality, just in terms of, just think, what is pleasurable to you? That would be a question. Frequency of sexual acts, what kinds of sexual acts? Where are your erogenous zones? There are so many ways to think about human sexuality, and it's roughly at the turn of the 20th century where we decide on sexual orientation. The sex that you are doing the acts with becomes kind of the defining feature of sexuality. That's a late way to be thinking about human sexuality. So what are we talking about here in these texts? Are the texts talking about a sexual orientation? A preference or a tendency? And when I say preference, I'm not saying that is something that you can or cannot choose. I am not saying that at all. Or is it discussing an action? So it's important not to associate orientation with the physical sex acts that people do or practice. And I'll just say, as we study this kind of topic, we need to keep those things in mind. And yes, when we talk about a loving or consensual relationship, like, what are the things that constitute a loving and consensual relationship? Sex is only one component of that. It's only a small, and it can be small or it can be large. It can vary on who you are and who you're with, right? But we've made this is the defining way that we determine who's right and who's wrong when it comes to human sexuality. Is this verse, and this is a point that that looms large in the literature. Is this verse addressing the insertive partner or the passive partner? You understand what I'm talking about there, I assume. Okay. In Numbers 31, come back now. In Numbers 31, in Judges 21, we do have the use of, if we go back and you saw beds of a woman, there are other places in the Old Testament where we find the phrase beds of a man. And it's always used in reference to a woman who's being talked about as being a virgin. And so in those contexts, it's understood that beds of a man seems to refer to the insertive partner in a relationship. If we go to Leviticus and we're talking beds of a woman, is this a reference to who's committing the abomination? Is it the insertive partner who's in the wrong, or is it the passive partner who's in the wrong? Or some of you might say it's both of them. How do you determine that? So the dominant, one of the first arguments put forth, which has remained kind of the argument that every other scholar is responding to, was put forth by a guy named Saul Olian, and he argues that the reference is to male same-sex anal sex, which would mean it's discussing the insertive partner. And that's how Saul Olian takes this. The abomination is committed by the insertive partner. But then other scholars have argued that this is a law aimed at the passive partner, that a free adult Israelite who takes the passive position in the act of sex is the one who's in the wrong and is committing the abomination. And you have various scholars that line up on both sides of that. Okay, so are you getting, when someone says the Bible says in an argument about gay people and whether they are right or wrong, the Bible says this, and they point to something like Leviticus. It's like, there's a whole scholarly discourse on what these verses may or may not mean. So I go through this to say that we need to be precise about what's being described as best we can. Are we talking about male same-sex intercourse? Notice also that what is not mentioned here. Female same-sex intercourse is not mentioned here. So, why is the prohibition there? Okay, this is when we get, last week we talked about the food laws. Why is pork prohibited? Why is certain seafood prohibited? There's arguments about, this is part of building identity. This is part about building Israelite identity. But then there are other archaeological indicators that point to us, the Philistines had a monopoly on pork, and so that could be an explanation for why the Israelites did not eat pork. And the Israelites did not have access to the Mediterranean Sea. So, it makes sense economically that you would prohibit these things. someone else had mentioned there's a possibility of disease that comes along with eating pork, handling pork, and that sort of thing. So inadvertently, though, they may have a good prohibitive measure. So we ask the same questions here with these laws, Leviticus 18 and 20. Why is this law here? That's, this is where scholars also get into a lot of debate. Here are some options, okay? Is this a blanket prohibition against all same-sex erotic behavior? As many today would take it to be. Here's what, okay.
Sure, they could be.
There.
There it goes.
Here's the problem. As I mentioned, female same-sex acts are not included. So if you want to say, yeah, this is about banning all same-sex attraction or actions, well, it only mentions one specific thing, and we can't. It's difficult to identify what that's actually talking about.
Could this also be related to the fact that the Israelites didn't count, when they do their head counts, women and children?
Oh, yes, that is, I would say that probably doesn't factor into this argument, but that is
But I
part
mean,
of the.
They didn't see, women.
Oh, right. We'll get
count.
to the point where I mentioned how all of these laws they're based on misogynistic views of women. Okay, that's definitely here. Nearly all ancient Near East and classical, so we're talking Hittite, Babylonian, Egyptian, and then later Greek laws have sexual regulations. This is a thing that we see in law codes from this time. But none of them contain a blanket prohibition against same-sex erotic acts. It's all very specific in defining the people involved and what they are doing. The Old Testament would be an outlier in that regard if it were a blanket prohibition on same-sex erotic acts. It's also worth noting that the first explicit interpretation of this verse as a blanket prohibition first appears in the late 4th century CE in a work called the Apostolic Constitutions. The Apostolic Constitutions just set out to say, here's the right interpretation, here's correct belief, right? This tendency in Christianity to want to do that for everything. But 4th century CE, that's when we get the idea, and I'll be careful here. It's the first evidence we have. It doesn't mean it was floating around elsewhere, but this is the first written evidence we have of these verses being explicitly tied to a blanket prohibition of same-sex acts. In that work, you also have the first link of Sodom with this idea. Okay, again, a later development in the interpretive tradition. It did not become the mainstream Christian reading until the Middle Ages. And that's where we get more of the dominant medieval theologians who are discussing these verses as blanket prohibitions. Again, Middle Ages. How do we define the Middle Ages? It's another debate. 500 to 1500, roughly. That's a huge amount of time. The peak of Christian and Jewish medieval exegesis is like the 1200 to 1300, 1200 to 1500s.
Yes.
Okay, another option. Are these laws to preserve an endogamous society? And this would go along with some of the, consider that Israel is surrounded by other smaller kingdoms. Israel is always trying to define its own identity. What group of human beings isn't trying to do that, right? They're always trying to define their own identity. So is this part of a larger strategy, worldview to preserve your people and to define who your people are? And in this regard, there's a concern with preserving Israel's holiness, right? You want to keep everything in the bounds of the land and in the bounds of your, along the same bloodlines. You want to be separate. You want to, keep yourself separate from surrounding Canaanite peoples. A concern with population maintenance, right? These go into these scholarly debates about why these laws are here. If you consider that the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, come together in their final form roughly in the Babylonian and early Persian period. So we're talking 600s to 500s. That's later than the historic period we're talking about. If you imagine that after Babylonian exile, when the Babylonians have come in, they've taken away all the elite from Judah, and they've carried them off to Babylon. They've taken they haven't taken everybody from the land, right? It's a myth that the Babylonians removed everyone from Judah. But your people just went through a traumatic experience of conquest by an empire, and now another empire comes in, and they're actually a little bit more lenient, the Persians, right? So if you think you're in a mindset of rebuilding, right? Rebuilding the temple, Ezra and Nehemiah, if you read those books, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding their people. So a concern like population maintenance would be, and procreation would be at top of mind if you are trying to preserve your people and you're worried about another empire coming in and wiping them out. Is this a prohibition against male rape? Okay, it's very common in warfare in the ancient world for a conquering people to assert their dominance and to shame the people that they've conquered, where male rape that is a thing that is practiced. Is this a prohibition against that? In a similar vein, is it a prohibition against temple prostitution? That's another argument that's been put forth. In the ancient world, in the ancient Near East, there's ancient Near Eastern evidence of institutionalized and regulated prostitution at temples. This was something that was allowed to happen. At the Jerusalem temple, is this something that's being explicitly prohibited? And again, to complicate things, what constituted prostitution? We think of certain things when we think of prostitution. It's difficult to know what was being spoken of. If this is the case, what did this mean at that time? Is there a purity concern? So going back to those laws and how laws preserve a holy space, a holy people, that sort of thing. Is there a purity concern vis-a-vis the improper mixture of fluids or improper placement of semen? Okay? And again, Hebrew and biblical Hebrew and the way the ancient laws discuss these things was just it's a very different way that we think about things. The counter argument to this, the improper placement of semen, is that nowhere is anal sex between a man and a woman prohibited. Okay? So again, when we're trying to figure out in Leviticus 18 and 20 what is being meant, another question to ask is, what is not being stated? Or to whom does this law not apply? That's another way of thinking, because if we're going to use it as a blanket prohibition, then it becomes problematic due to just the lack of specificity and the fact that there are no corroborating injunctions that kind of work with it. Are you sufficiently confused, or Okay, so let's this is my last slide, and then hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. So homosexuality as a sexual orientation was not a real concern in Mesopotamia, and the evidence we have is not easily mapped onto our modern conceptions of sexuality and gender. These are like my summarizing points, okay? These are my summarizing points. These ancient laws, however you view them, are premised on misogyny. So, all of the laws around sexual relations in the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East were constructed to benefit the active or penetrative partner, the insertive partner, which is typically the man, right? The legal, the legal material is strictly concerned with issues of power, social class, and maintaining ancient conceptions of appropriate gender roles and power boundaries. So all of these ancient laws are premised on misogyny because they're constructed to benefit the man in the relationship. And I point this out to highlight the reality that in a modern legal or ethical context, these laws should be excluded from our consideration because I think we can all agree that premising a piece of legislation on a misogynistic ideology or view is not something we want to do. While no scholarly consensus has materialized about what these texts do say, there has been a growing consensus about what these texts don't say. They are not a blanket condemnation of homosexuality. And in studying these, it is not merely an exegetical issue. We could, I pointed out to you the difficulty of the Hebrew and the difficulty in trying to render that Hebrew into something that is intelligible to us today. It's not just about that. It's also a hermeneutical issue of how, let's say you would figure that out. You crack the code, you figure out what the Hebrew actually says. Well, then what do you do with it? How do you read it? And what do you do with it after that? It's also possible that you could be a queer person or an ally and conclude that these texts do constitute an ancient ban on homosexuality. You can say that. There are LGBTQ scholars out there who are willing to say, yeah, this text is anti-gay. This text is a prohibition. And you know what? I don't care because it's an ancient text. And it doesn't apply to me. So that is another legitimate view to take. Mark Stone, he has a great article where he doesn't summarize every view, all the 21 views, but the main ones. In Mark Stone's article, he closes by saying, regardless of how you interpret these texts, there is no hermeneutical vantage from which we can treat these clobber texts without profound implications for marginalized communities. Okay? And so that's where I want us to, that's the end of my presentation. So now it's a question of what's the relationship between the Bible and modern ethical frameworks or theological frameworks? So this is open discussion. Not that.
Well, coming from healthcare, decisions are data-driven in healthcare. There's just nothing solid enough for me to say, well, I can make a policy on this.
Okay, so in healthcare, decisions are based on data. Yeah, this is a good thing.
Yeah.
There's not enough data here to make a decision.
And law.
Very good. No argument for me on that. Yeah. Yeah.
But I think we also need to look at the text in context to the time and the culture there. There's no issue raised against slavery. Jesus did not talk about it, I don't think. And we obviously don't embrace that concept ourselves today. So again, and being a woman, don't care for the misogyny. Just saying.
Right.
If I ever knew, I'd forgotten. What do exegetical and grammatical mean?
What do those words mean?
Exegetical literally means to read out. And I have problems with the term because exegetical is set up with as saying you're going to go to the text and you're objectively going to be able to take into consideration the historical context, the cultural context. You're going to put aside all of your baggage and you're going to bring out the correct interpretation.
There's an answer.
Yes. I think that all exegesis is eisegesis. Eisegesis is reading into a text. I come down on how do you present your reading? Did you do your homework? Are you based on all the evidence that you can present and then present your reading? Does that make sense? So I would say that eisegesis is unavoidable, but in the arguments and in the debates, it's always set up as, well, you're either doing exegesis or you're doing eisegesis, right? Exegesis, good. Eisegesis, bad. You're fooling yourself. There's no, right? We're always reading. You can't put aside who you are and the ways you think about things and the ideologies that govern how you interpret the world. Those are always with you. Be mindful of them in your reading and go from there. And in that regard, I don't think it's an accident that in the last 30 years is when a lot of this scholarship on this passage has been produced. Why? Because there's been a lot of intentional discourse about this stuff in the last 20 to 30 years. And that's fine. That is perfectly fine. It doesn't mean that, what's the other argument you get? Oh, if you don't take the Bible literally, then you're just going with the current, whatever's trendy. I came out of a fun, you say, you get to say whatever you want.
There's the pot calling the kettle black.
Yes. But okay, it was exegesis, and you said hermeneutical.
Yeah.
There are a lot of hermeneutical is how kind of like think of it as a lens, like a lens you use to read the text. There are many lenses you can use to read a text today. You could use a feminist lens, and you get a lot of feminist scholars who are doing exclusively feminist work, and now finally male scholars in the field are like, oh yeah, feminist hermeneutics and exegesis. This is a good thing. We should all be embracing this. You could have a Black liberation perspective or hermeneutic, and that specifically comes out of the Black theological tradition, where you approach the Bible in that regard. You have readings now called womanist readings. Womanist is Black female readings of the text. So the hermeneutical lens is the various tools that you use to read the text. So there's some overlap with exegesis and hermeneutics, but does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yes.
But how many people trying to shape laws and shape public opinion are scholars who are going to do this kind of research?
Thank you.
Various opinions.
Are you talking about in the United States? It always, it amazes me how, I don't know. It amazes me how, I don't know. When I look at in Ohio, the kinds of legislation that comes out, I'm just like, it's terrible. Did you talk to any experts on this?
Zero prejudice.
Yeah.
Experts are a small voting bloc.
Small voting bloc, and increasingly don't want anything to do with the legislative process, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, they're also not asked.
Or listen to.
Amen. Because I would love to, on the transsexual issues right now, ask them who their licensed medical experts were that gave them advice.
Yeah.
And please list.
Yeah.
With contact information.
Even that kind of approach is problematic because the experts are also goodness error-prone people. I listened to a really cool podcast that's on Hidden Brain right now about a psychologist, Daniel Goodman or something, who wrote about and talked about how the human brain is a pattern-seeking, meaning-oriented, makes sense of the world. That's what we do. And it's only recently that we've had the tools available to us to look at massive amount of statistics and understand things in the aggregate and see where the truth is from a scientific perspective. Scientists don't get it yet. Scientists will, doctors will, instead of looking at the research on how something, all these statistics, they'll say, well, the last case I had worked this way, and so it should work that way for you. They think so powerfully of their own experience. So, and I know that we're trying to improve that, and it's going in the right direction, but it's just natural for all of these people to take their own personal experience and apply it rather than look at something that is recently developed, which is massive amounts of information.
What do you take in constructing, whether we're talking about laws, whether we're talking about an ethical standard, what do you take into consideration to do that? Is experience part of that? Is experience only part of that? How do you balance all of, experience? How do you balance reason? How do you balance tradition? And this is more like a theological framework, because my next question is going to be, I think it's easy for us to point out how these laws have no place in modern civil laws, okay? But a lot of the people who still take these laws authoritatively are doing it in a theological framework. So what's your theology? What place, how do we use the Bible in our theology? That is what I would press us to think about, and to be okay with saying, you know what? We don't take this literally. There are places in here that are very meaningful, places in the Bible that are very meaningful. But in terms of modern ethical discussions, we always need to be aware and be able to say, you know what, this doesn't really have a place in a modern ethical discussion. Or maybe we say it does, and then we'll discuss why then it doesn't, right? Bring it into the conversation, and then, I think, okay, Tori,
Just for my own clarity, I want to check in, and I believe you said all exegesis.
all exegesis
is
is eisegesis. Yeah.
So then I ask, is a truly literal interpretation of these texts possible? It seems to me not, but what's your response so that for my clarity?
My response is going to be that prioritizing a literal reading of the text, or taking the text literally, is a product of the late 1800s and early 1900s fundamentalist movement, which made biblical inerrancy and prioritized a literal reading one of their top principles. Okay, so that's the fundamentalist movement. There's a pamphlet that was put out with the 5 most important beliefs to be a Christian. One was biblical inerrancy, belief in the Virgin Mary, that was one of them. And there were some other, literal second coming of Jesus Christ. There's some of these things that for us today, it seems like they've always been a part of the discourse. This has always been a part of what it means to be Christian. And no, it hasn't. I'm not saying that ancient people didn't believe that Mary was a virgin. I'm just saying that the idea that these are unquestionable tenets of faith that you have to hold to be in the right, that's a late development in the tradition. So the idea that we need a literal interpretation, or that is somehow good, or that somehow helps us understand God or the world, I disagree with that. I think as PCUSA, Presbyterians, I think you would also agree that a literal reading is not always the most helpful. As a scholar, I am trained to interpret the Hebrew or Greek or whatever as closely as possible to the original language. So usually, like, my process when I'm translating is I do a very wooden translation, just so that I can, I'm working with every word here and I'm trying to be as close to the original language as possible. But then I always tell my students, like, there's some flexibility here. You have to make this intelligible to modern English readers. So yeah. So does that answer your question?
To a great extent.
To a degree, okay. All right.
Absolutes are much less of a thing in life
Yeah.
than sometimes I would like them to be, but that's just the reality of it.
Now, if you were to render all of the Bible literally, like word for word, it would all sound really strange.
Well, you gave some great examples of that.
These verses are actually it's like you have a level of strange, and then you have like, this is just really complicated. And there are other verses in the Hebrew Bible where if you go into like a critical scholarly Hebrew Bible, there'll be notes everywhere on, like, you'll see certain verses, some verses have like a small amount of notes. And then other verses have a big block of notes because the manuscript tradition, all of the variants that we have, you can just tell no one knew what to do with this verse. This verse was so convoluted that scribes were making weird insertions and switching words around and swapping like pronouns out here and there. That's ancient. We could do a whole class on ancient scribal practices and how, like, what that actually looked like. But so you come across these verses in the Bible that just like, oh yeah, that was a problem verse. No scribe knew what to do with that.
So in that case, the complexity, the convoluted structure of some of the Bible, you always kind of just say, oh, the heck with it. I'm gonna go read it elsewhere.
Yeah, you may as well just be like, just appreciate the fact that human beings have struggled understanding this verse for centuries, and not think that you're going to be so great as to somehow come up with the magic answer.
So how stable are these ancient texts?
Ancient texts are not stable at all. The idea that you would have a manuscript, let's say manuscript A, okay? We would think, okay, manuscript A is going to be copied by Joe Schmo scribe, and you're going to get manuscript A1, okay? It's going to be a perfect copy. Well, actually, Joe Schmo scribe, because there's no electricity and he can't see very well and he makes some mistakes. You're sitting all day for hours on end reading and copying. He switches some words around here and there just by accident. And we don't actually get manuscript A1. It's more like, I don't know. It's more like, no, I wasn't prepared for this discussion. I don't have a good illustration. The manuscript gets corrupted because of human error. And this actually becomes manuscript B, which has some relation to A. But then as it continues to be copied by scribes, and it continues to be copied and eventually there was a Greek manuscript over here that was kind of a Greek manuscript was made from the Hebrew, and so then this got in here, and you get Greek copies, and then all of a sudden you start to have some intermingling with, Greek, and you have multiple manuscripts interacting with one another. So the text is not stable. And we could do a class on the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the best evidence we have that scribes did not hold themselves to copying word for word from a text. At Qumran, the finds where the Dead Sea Scrolls came, we find scribes that are writing their own notes and rewriting parts of the Bible. Because no text was stable at this point. There's no version that's like, okay, this is the Bible, and that's it. Scribes took some creative liberties in how they interpreted things, and there's a whole tradition that we could use to illustrate that. I know that church starts soon, so.
Well, they thought they were inspired and they had a better idea.
Yes.
And they stuck that in there.
Yeah, exactly. They thought that they were, this is a phrase that gets used, they thought that they were healing the text. There are places where, like, oh, this text doesn't make sense.
So
I'm going to heal the text.
So how do a normal person, whatever that means, have any hope of, you're not really, maybe you're reading anything that's.
Yeah, I know. What I would say is,
Holy mackerel.
the text is completely unstable until the modern printing press. So until you get to the Middle Ages, once you get away from scribes hand copying manuscripts, that's when you start to get, okay, here's a fixed text. We finally have it. But I would say, up until the Middle Ages, when everything was being hand copied, it's a mess. It's a complete mess.
Very obtuse. So.
I mean, we always say that Jerome is the translator who produced the first Latin version of the Bible. That's mostly false. Jerome produced the authoritative Latin version because he was such a genius and well-read person that he could take all of the really crappy Latin manuscripts that were out there. He read basically all of them and decided which ones were probably the better copies and used those. So there's a science behind figuring out what is the best reading, what is the best manuscript, and that's called textual criticism. And scholars have been practicing that since the 200s and 300s. We could have a class on Origen of Alexandria and how he get his stuff. Okay, you guys gotta go. Thank you so much for having me. Nice being with you all.